Welcome to the Ottawa Business Journal's live broadcast of Logging Out, Demystifying an Employee's Right to Disconnect. I'm Michael Curran from the Ottawa Business Journal. Thank you for joining us today. We have hundreds of people online, both on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And as always, we want to make today's show an interactive one. And that means we really want to hear from you on whatever social media channel that you're on. You can share your comments and questions, and we'll be addressing those in about 25 to 30 minutes. We've got a really relevant discussion today. It's an issue I think that's top of mind for business owners and managers, particularly this time of year as we look to go on vacation and actually, unplug from work. The issue at hand is the right to disconnect. And of course, many white collar workers are still working from home. And that has all sorts of advantages. There's no commuting time, more uninterrupted heads down work. But now that so many of us have established home offices with remote technology, we're seeing some downsides or some complications at least from home offices, notably work hours that are less defined. So we're all not showing up at an office at a certain time and leaving at a certain time. And sometimes there's that need to urgently communicate with our colleagues who are not sitting in the next cubicle or the next office over. Recognizing all of this, the Ontario government introduced and enacted Bill 27, which is called the Working for Workers Act 2021. It requires, and listen to this as a key point, it requires employers of 25 or more employees to have written policies in place disconnecting from work. The initial deadline, in fact, is already passed. It was June 2nd, so we're past that. And these policies have been commonly described as the right to disconnect. They do not create, and this will be a key point again in the discussion we're about to have in just a second, it does not create a freestanding right to disconnect. So as you can imagine, this is causing a lot of misunderstanding, and that's particularly true when it comes to employment and labor law. So to demystify this and provide you with some clarity, we have two experts joining us today. It's not the first time we've seen them. In fact, you saw them with us they were with us in March 2022. And let's welcome them now without further delay. Our first guest is Neil Juba, an associate at Eamon Harnden. Welcome to you, Neil.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for having us back.
Great. And our second guest is Patrick Twagira Yezu, an associate also at Eamon Harnden. Welcome, Patrick.
Hey, Michael. Thanks for having us again.
How are you guys doing today?
We're doing well. Like many, we are in the midst of trying to figure out all these new requirements and legislation that's come down the pipes. And I don't want to jinx anything at all. And please don't blame me if things go the other direction, but it looks like some of the pandemic issues are now in the rearview mirror.
Careful. Yeah. You're jinxing us.
and as we transition to an endemic, we'll put it that way. How's that?
That's good.
We're beginning to now be able to focus on some other issues that have come up. And again, like it's disconnecting or the right to disconnect or disconnecting from work type of policies. It's just one of those things now that it has a bit more prominence. It's a bit more out there now that we're able to shift the focus. Our last discussion was vaccination policies, not so much of an issue at the very moment. So different focus right about now.
And it's evolving world of employment and labor law.
Never dull moment.
It's keeping you guys and us on the edge of our seats. Patrick, I just wanted to check in with you. It seems like this issue has snuck up on us a little bit. Like, we've all been talking, maybe even pre-pandemic, about the right to disconnect, but now we've got some legislation right here in Ontario, and maybe a few of us have thought of the sense of this, but they're not fully aware of the legislation. Is that right, Patrick?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way that you've put it, to say that it snuck up on us, I think it's something that for years has certainly been a discussion. And as we become more hyper connected, as you can basically take your workplace with you on your smartphone. These are all things that have changed. And I think that the discussions have been out there in the fringe a little bit, depending on where you are in the world. It's been a more prominent discussion depending on where you're placed geographically. But I think that as we start to move forward with the last 2 years, and we've seen that, like you've just mentioned, there's a lot more productivity, but at the same time, you do get the sense that, my job is not necessarily simply related to where I am physically. And it seems that the Ontario government, at least in this respect, is trying to sort of do something about it. But as we'll learn throughout the discussion today, there is still a lot of discretion given to employers, and it'll come down to the specific workplace, and the actual contents of the policies still remain to be seen, because the government may make changes down the line.
It's a great start. Thank you, gentlemen, for teeing this up. We're going to walk people through our agenda. We've actually broken the show down to 6 components, so very kind of digestible, short, punchy topics here. The first topic is, what does the right to disconnect mean for employers? So we're going to define it, of course. We're going to get to know Bill 27. So there's a requirement for employers with more than 25 employees, so we just talked about. Number 3 topic is what your right to disconnect policy should include. So if you need a policy, what's in the policy? What a policy will mean in topic 4 for day-to-day operations. I think that's an important one to think through. Like, what does this actually mean to our operations? Number 5, other obligations regarding the policy. And number 6, because as noted here, I think there's going to be an evolution to this legislation, what the requirements are. So how to stay up to date on your right to disconnect policy. And then we're going to you, the viewers, with questions from the audience. We anticipate that will happen sometime around 12:25, and I'll be watching and moderating. But you can start asking the questions early. Don't wait. If you've got something on your mind, we want to hear from you. So Patrick, we're going to kick things off now with topic number 1, as we just covered. It is what does the right to disconnect mean for employers? So let's define this a little bit, Patrick.
Thanks, Michael. So what you have to understand here is that the right to disconnect typically is the concept that employees should be able to disconnect from workplace communication channels outside of working hours. The concept looks to address connectivity and work-life balance. So as we've mentioned, as we're sort of in the pandemic, and Neil has stated the endemic, there are lingering effects and this idea that we're always connected to the workplace. And this is one of those concepts that's put in place to sort of draw a line in terms of work-life balance. And for employees who may be interested in the right to disconnect in order to be free from communications in their off hours. But as we'll also learn, there's already a built-in mechanism in terms of employment agreements and other agreements, such as a collective agreement, maybe that refer to the hours of work. So there are already built-in mechanisms that actually state what what is needed in terms of work hours, what is needed in terms of having to respond to work obligations. But this policy, or this idea of a policy, comes to sort of put it in place to say that there needs to be some parameters around it. And for employers, the right to disconnect may be a complicated issue, because there may be a need to balance providing employees with time away from work-related communications in their off hours on one hand, but on the other hand, you may have legitimate business needs that have to be addressed. So depending on the nature of the business and the employee's specific duties, the right to disconnect may be more feasible for some employers than it is for others.
I get your point. So we're really talking about what happens in off hours, how we define those off hours, and then the complicating part, Patrick, is that, listen, work gets done sometimes in off hours, and sometimes there's a need for urgent communication. So do those people need to maintain a little bit of connection and be watching for incoming messages? So good way to start this off. We're starting to define it. Neil, we're going to go to you now to talk about the actual legislation, Bill 27. Take it away.
Okay. So I apologize in advance if I'm going to sound like a bit of a broken record here, but there is some confusion. This idea of the right to disconnect and what obligations Bill 27 has actually created. So a lot of people have called Bill 27 and its requirement as a right to disconnect, or create a policy about a right to disconnect, but the legislation does not provide such a right. So there's no specific requirement that a policy or employer's policy prohibits an employer from contacting their employees when they're outside of the working hours. We'll get to that in a minute, but Patrick kind of alluded to that just a couple minutes ago. What the legislation requires is that employers put a written policy in place that relates to the notion of disconnecting to work. So I think some of this confusion kind of comes from the notion or the term disconnecting from work, because it's defined, and I'll read it from how it's defined in the legislation. But it's defined as not engaging in work-related communications, including emails, telephone calls, video calls, or sending or reviewing of other messages so as to be free from the performance of work. But again, so that's, I think, where a lot of this confusion is coming from. And if you read more into the legislation, again, it doesn't actually grant employees a right to disconnect from the workplace. Where the obligation arises is for employers to put in place a policy that will speak to its expectations when it comes to employees from disconnecting to work. So the rights of employees under the Employment Standards Act in terms of when or when not to perform work, those still exist elsewhere. So meal periods, hours of work, overtime, those things still exist. But again, and here comes the broken record part, this legislation does not impose obligations to allow employees to just completely shut off from work. And one thing to be very cautious of as an employer too is you don't want to create a policy that provides a right that does not exist in the legislation or steps above that. So the language that you use in drafting a policy, be very cautious, because you don't want to provide employees with a general right to disconnect. Because if you do that, you may be creating a greater right or benefit than what's required under the legislation. And if you do that, that right to disconnect that you have created in a policy that doesn't exist in the ESA will actually govern. So be very cautious. Just a couple of small things too. Michael, you had alluded to this earlier on in the introduction about how employers with 25 or more employees as of January 1 of this year should have had a policy in place by June 2nd. And that's going to carry forward. So beginning in 2023, so employers with 25 or more employees on Jan 1 of each year will have their written policies in place. And if you have less than 25 employees on January 1 in a given year, we'll say 2023 going forward, you don't have that obligation. And if you do have 25 employees on January 1st, you do have an obligation to have such a policy in place. If the number of employees falls during the year below 25, that requirement to have the policy, that maintains in place as well.
Okay.
So if you're below, you don't need one, even if you creep up above the 25. But if you're above 25 on January 1, you have your policy. You fall below 25 employees during that year, that policy still applies.
Interesting. So I think I heard two key things from you there, Neil. So one is it is not illegal to contact your employees after work hours. So I think I clearly heard you on that point. And the requirement is simply to have a policy. So did I get both those 2 points right there, Neil?
Cole's Notes version, absolutely.
Okay, got it. Okay, so I'm following. We got 6 of these, so we're gonna keep on going through them. So we're gonna go back to Patrick. So again, it's not illegal to contact your employees after work hours. If you have more than 25 employees, you need a policy. So Patrick, you're going to address what should be in that policy.
That's right, Michael. So, in preparing a policy on disconnecting from work, employers have to include the date the policy was prepared and the date any changes were made to the policy. The Employment Standards Act does not otherwise specify the information that has to be included in the policy. So, as a result, although the subject of the policy must obviously be on disconnecting from work, it is employers who determine the contents of the policy itself. And I mentioned this at the outset. There's still a lot of discretion here that's given to employers. And as Neil has mentioned and was reiterated by Michael here, that the obligation is to have the policy. Its contents really might depend. So the Ministry of Labor's guide has given some ideas as to what might be in the policy. For example, they mentioned that the employer could implement their expectations, if any, of employees to read or reply to work-related emails or answer work-related phone calls after their shift is over. You may include the employer's expectations for different situations. For example, depending on the time of the day or the time of the day of the communication, the subject matter of the communication, and the individual initiating the communication. And finally, another example could be the employer's requirements for employees turning on out of office notifications and or changing their voicemail messages when they are not working to advise when they will respond to communications. So we can see here that there are examples, different things that you can put in there, that it may depend on your specific workplace, but there isn't any actual obligation as to what the content has to be. And the manual that's been put together by the Ministry of Labor also notes that the Employment Standard Act's rules on when work is deemed to perform could apply. So if an employee engages in an activity such as reviewing or writing emails, this would generally be considered working time under the Employment Standards Act, even if it's done after work hours and when a disconnecting from work policy says employees should not work from home. Employers can have a single policy that applies to all employees, or their policy can contain different policies for different groups of employees. The policy can be standalone, or it can also be part of another document, such as a comprehensive policy manual. And this is something that we're already starting to see some of our clients take that approach, or they have a standalone policy. Again, it may be a matter of the particular culture or the workplace practices of that particular employer. And as noted above, the Employment Standards Act doesn't specifically create a right for employees to disconnect from work. Now, this is important because Neil has mentioned it. It's not a right to disconnect from work. That's not something that this legislation puts in place, and it's not anything that your policy should necessarily be putting in place. Rather, the employee rights under the act to not perform work are established through pre-existing rules, as I briefly stated at the beginning of my of this presentation, including those on hours of work and eating periods, vacation with pay, public holidays, and deemed work. So they're already pre-existing parameters that sort of limit what has to be done and when it has to be done. So employers should be cautious in their policy wording, not to give employees a right not to perform work when the act would otherwise not permit it. So contractual wording that stipulates such a right or provides protections that are greater than what is provided by the Employment Standards Act, as addressed by Neil earlier, could create a greater right or benefit that may apply in place of the lesser obligation outlined in the Employment Standards Act. So employers who must develop a policy by June 2022 should take the time and be careful in developing a policy to ensure compliance with the limited legislative requirements and consistency with workplace culture and expectations.
There's always complexity in employment and labor legislation. When you were speaking there, Patrick, I really do think people probably need to reach out to lawyers, get some professional help, because you said it and Neil said it too. You got to be careful you don't extend a right that goes beyond what the legislation was intended to do, because how are you going to roll that back? Yeah, I've got so many questions, but we'll keep on moving here. And of course, if you're watching, I'm sure you've got questions. I'm noting some are starting to come in. So if you're like me, there's lots, and I want to hear from you. Give our audience the opportunity for that. So Neil, I'm really eager for you to address topic number 4 here, because it's what does the policy mean for day-to-day operations? So in so many of these cases, we want to know what is the real impact.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and it's almost like looking into a crystal ball right about now, because it's all so new to us. It's really going to depend upon each individual workplace's policy and how they want to address it. I know that some workplaces can have a bit more flexibility in terms of, okay, we don't need perhaps we don't have the type of workplace where there's going to be a lot of communication beyond, say, 5 o'clock in the evening until 9 o'clock in the morning on weekends. You look at our type of workplace, or if you've got clients that are Canada-wide, it's harder to, fit expectations between a 9 to 5 workplace. So it's really what it's going to look like on a day-to-day basis is going to be contingent quite significantly on the type of workplace you have. And your policy will probably reflect what you're already doing right now, how your business operates. What I think that the benefit of having these types of policies in place will have is that it's going to create an opportunity for, as an employer, to make their expectations clear about off-hours work or off-hour communication. That is, I think, bringing back to Michael, what you had discussed earlier on, and Patrick alluded to, we've been living in this universe where, you don't have to physically be in the office anymore. You can take, as Patrick had said, you can basically do your job for some people on your smartphone. And so the idea of, my day is not so longer 8 to 5 or what have you. It can start at 5 in the morning for a couple hours. I can take breaks. It can extend into the evening. I think these policies will help create some clarity or make some expectations about, off-hours communication. And the benefit to that as well is that hopefully this is going to mean that there'd be more certainty amongst employees and less misunderstandings about, okay, what are the expectations if an email comes to me at 9 o'clock in the evening? And do I answer? How do I answer? That type of thing.
I like that point too, Neil, that, it is an opportunity, right? So it's an opportunity to have an open discussion with a team of people about what the expectations are in terms of work. And so I like that point. Like often we get bogged down in the details, and we need to, but it is a little bit of opportunity for people to embrace that.
Absolutely. And things have changed a lot in the past two years. And again,
yeah,
now we're sort of transitioning to a different phase of this process. And now is the time to have the conversations about these, and we're required to now because of this new legislation.
Yeah, we have lots of questions coming in now, so we'll keep on rolling here, and I'll stay out of your way. Patrick, you're going to help us with topic number 5, which is other obligations. So not only the obligations that we've been talking about in this policy, but there's some other ones. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the other types of obligations that you can sort of keep in mind, one of them is certainly the question of timelines. So employers will have to provide a copy of the policy to all employees within 30 days of preparing or changing the policy. New employees must be provided with a copy of the policy within 30 days of becoming employed. And a copy does not need to be provided to employees annually if the policy has not changed from the previous year, as the obligation to provide a copy to employees only arises within 30 days of preparing or changing the policy. What is interesting here is that this is a sort of a built-in mechanism to the legislation, and there seems to be leeway here in terms of changes that may come about. So this may be an indication that perhaps there's going to be more direction coming from the government down the line about this type of policy, its contents, perhaps more about the process that has to be followed or the form of the policy. So that's something to keep in mind. The ability here that's given, or the timelines that are given for making changes and advising employees, is an important piece to keep in mind, because it does seem to signal that the government realizes that there might be a lot of changes, a lot of additions, or maybe just few, but in any case, that it's an evolving process. The ministry's policies, that where an employer has multiple policies that apply to different employees, the employer is only required to provide an employee with a copy of the policy that applies to that employee. So the ministry's policy is also that the policy can be provided in hard copy by email or by link to a document or an internet database if the employee has reasonable access to that database. Other requirements can be prescribed by regulation, as I've mentioned, and may come down the line. But at the time that we're having this discussion right now, no such regulations have been passed. Another thing to keep in mind here is the records retention piece of the policy. So employers will be required to retain copies of every disconnecting from work policy for 3 years after the policy ceases to be in effect. They must also ensure that copies are readily available for inspection by an employment standards officer upon request.
Wow. Okay. Some good things to think about. Again, the questions keep on coming in, but our final topic, Neil, and then we'll get to this interactive portion. As Patrick just said, this is evolving. So how do people stay up to date on all of this?
Absolutely. Sorry, my lights just kind of went out here.
Oh,
it's a bit dark, but
it's very dramatic. I like the look, actually.
bright at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, you're good.
So I guess the best starting point is there's a guide to the Employment Standards Act that the ministry has. It's online. It's easily accessible, and there is a section in the guide on disconnecting from work. So that will provide some basic information, and that's a good resource to consult as a starting point, and it gets updated if any changes are made. Of course, being under the Employment Standards Act and under Bill 27, the government can pass regulations relating to the content of policies. So that's another avenue that employers can stay up to date. Now, when regulations are made, they are well known. They're going to be published and so forth. As a law firm, we would issue bulletins providing information about the regulations, how that changes, and that type of thing. So yeah, the government can issue these regulations. They don't do it all that often, but I foresee in the coming months, if not year or so, when it comes to this specific piece of legislation, there will be something that will be released to provide some additional clarity as to obligations and so forth around this piece of legislation.
Okay.
And I guess the last sort of area where there could be some updates is if there are complaints filed. So like the rest of the Employment Standards Act, if an employee files a complaint, it would go to an Employment Standards Officer. And where you could potentially see a decision down the road, if that gets appealed, it goes to the Ontario Labour Relations Board. They would potentially, at the end of the day, release a decision, and those are available to the public. So that could also be a means to, or for somebody to provide some clarity on particular areas of the legislation that may not have been clear or may have been contravened in that particular circumstance.
Okay, so we can keep an eye open for that. So let's move to this interactive session here, and I'll bring some comments on screen from a few of our viewers. This one is joining us on YouTube, and it's from Vanessa Balrose. Hopefully I got your name right. Is it only for employees who work from home, or what about hybrid or blue collar workers? So maybe there's a double question there. Is it only for employees? Patrick, we'll start with you on that one. Is it only for employees who work from home?
So no, it's for all employees. Given that there might be aspects of your work where you work in the office, but you have an email account, and so when you're home, you may receive emails related to work, but you don't only work from home. And again, that may also depend on, even if you're doing something a little more manual in terms of work, or a little more labor based. But at the end of the day, the real question becomes one of the employer's discretion. So, for example, if the employer determines that certain aspects of the policy are going to apply differently to certain groups of employees, as we've previously mentioned, then they may sort of craft the policy to make up for those differences, or to recognize those differences. But in terms of the obligation to employers, it does apply to all employers, and the aspect of it that matters is the number of employees, as was mentioned by Neil earlier.
Yeah, and there's no distinction between office workers or blue collar workers, so to speak. Although I heard you on that point, Patrick, you could have separate policies within the same company for each of those groups if there was a different requirement for them to, watch for emails or text or something like that.
And just
Yeah, go ahead, Neil, jump in.
Just one piece on that too. If you have 2 or 3 or different policies, depending on the type of workers you have, of course, there's the obligation to provide the policy to the workers. But if you have, say, a blue collar group, you can give them the blue collar, so to speak, policy on disconnecting. If you have a white collar group or an office group, you only need to. So they don't have to be giving everybody all the policies, only the one that's relevant to them. That's the one that you provide them.
Okay. And this is a really good question, also coming from a YouTube viewer. I'll read it. And Neil, you can tackle this one. Would an amendment to an existing policy suffice if we already have work hours and the like outlined? Sounds like this could potentially be covered by a sentence or two rather than a whole policy. So let's assume, of course, there are 25 employees and up, and you tackle that one, Neil.
Yeah. You would want to create your own disconnect from work policy. Like, that's to have a standalone. That's what you would create, because that's what the legislation requires you to have. So I get probably in some instances, and depending on the workplace, and then some could already have their own type of disconnecting from work policy that existed prior to all of this legislation coming in, but you'd want to create a separate one. That's the requirement under the legislation, just to address this issue.
And maybe if I can throw this one at you, just kind of as a follow-up of Byron. So I also understood throughout the show today that your work hours can be defined in an employment agreement or an overall employee handbook or a policy. They don't have to be necessarily in this right to disconnect policy. Is that right, Neil?
That is correct, yes.
Okay.
And typically your workday will be in a different type of policy.
Okay.
Or work hours.
And again, sorry for digging in even more on that. Would Eamon Harnden and the experts there generally put work hours in an employment agreement, or is that best in an employee handbook or a policy document?
That generally depends upon the workplace. We've seen
Okay.
both. Many have it in policies. Some put it into contracts.
Okay.
no hard and fast rule on that one. That's
Okay. And as is often the case, it's dependent upon so much. The next question, will Patrick, go to you on this one. It's from Rudolph Dalmas, who's also joining us on YouTube. And it's a very Ottawa question. I like this. Good question, Rudolph. Will the policy apply to federal public service employees working in Ontario? And does this apply to more private sector employees?
That's a really good question, and Rudolph. I laugh, Michael. You wouldn't know this. Rudolph went to my high school. He and I
I
were on
like it.
student council together back in the day. But the answer to that is that if you're a federal sector public service employee, this won't apply to you. That there's a separate jurisdiction for that. So everything we've addressed today really does apply to. And usually, by the way, the question of employment, and not to get into the specifics of constitutional law and the division of powers, but it does usually fall within the jurisdiction of a province. But the federal public service is it's a jurisdiction of its own that falls under federal jurisdiction. So nothing that we've discussed today specifically addresses employees that are in the federal public sector or public service. Sorry.
And a point of clarification on that one, Patrick. So yeah, I got you. Doesn't apply to federal public servants living here in Ottawa or elsewhere. What if you were a public servant in Ontario? So like you worked at the hospital or you worked at Algonquin College or something like that.
Yeah. So in that respect, it would apply.
Okay.
So if you're a public servant working for a provincial organization or provincial public service organization or employer, then this would apply. Yes.
Okay. And we have a lot of questions here, so get ready, gentlemen. We'll go back to you, Neil, on this one, also from YouTube. And here we go. This one's interesting too. What about employers who employ staff who are exempt from overtime requirements in the ESA, such as public accountants? Of course, they have this massive crush of work, in the spring during when the tax deadlines come. How do you balance that with the right to disconnect policy? So again, if people are exempt, I didn't even know that was possible, from overtime requirements in the ESA, how does this apply?
Yeah, like it would be addressed in the policy. So as Patrick has alluded to, it's sort of you're creating expectations around answering phones, emails, so forth, outside of normal working hours. So again, even if you're exempt for that, we'll say for accountants, for example, it can be reconciled with one of these policies. It's just you're creating expectations. Like for example, you would put something in the policy along the lines of, we respect that we would like people to have downtime. The reality is there are going to be times where we can't fit within a workday 9 to 5 time frame, and the expectation is, given the nature of our business, we do law, for example, we're going to have people sending frantic emails at 9-10 o'clock at night. That's the reality of it, and the expectation is this is going to happen.
Yeah, good point. And I think let's underline again that there's nothing legally preventing an employer from communicating with their employees. So let's just keep that after hours. Let's just keep that in mind as we're going through. Vanessa Valeros has a kind of a simple one, I think. Sample on, so where to see it? Should this be in a guide or a manual, I guess is what she's asking. And and Byron asked a similar question here. I'll bring it up. Does the policy have to be provided separately, or can it be in a policy or manual? Any advice on that, Patrick?
So much like the question of hours of work, where do you place it? It's a lot of it comes down to your decision as an employer, or it's your discretion. So already we've seen this policy be put within a general context of a manual with some employers that we work with, and others have standalone ones. And I mentioned it during my thoughts today when I was speaking, that at the end of the day, it really is up to you. What's important is that employees be aware of the policy, that they be informed of amendments and changes to the policy, and as Neil alluded to when we were talking about blue collar versus white collar workers, if you have multiple policies, that the relevant policy that applies to those employees be provided to them. So the form is not necessarily important, or the way in which it's presented. Even the the approach taken. So whether you do it online or you give people a hard copy version of it, those things are not important. What matters is that the employees are informed of it, and of course that you have the policy.
Okay, and we're into overtime, so I apologize. We won't get to all these questions, but maybe we'll touch on a couple quick ones. I think, Neil, the next one's for you. If an employer works at the firm, are they part of the minimum 25? So when you're counting up employees, does it include the boss? I guess I could paraphrase.
Yeah, if it's the requirement is who has an employment relationship with the employer as on January 1st, for example, of a given year. And so you would include that. If they have an employment relationship, they're included in the count of 25.
Okay, and Patrick, we'll go to you probably for the last question. And this one's, we haven't quite covered this. How about the employees that are already covered by a collective agreement? But I think we've kind of said it doesn't matter if you're a private sector or covered by a collective, unionizing covered by a collective agreement. Is that the case?
Yeah, and generally speaking, a collective agreement will require that employees act within the confines of the employer's policies, and the employer is also required to sort of have policies and work within the parameters of those policies. Uh, Within the collective agreement context, there are larger questions, perhaps those relating to whether or not the policy is reasonable, whether it's particular to that workplace. But again, I think that's a case by case basis. So its application to unionized environments, and the question really only matters whether or not there's a challenge to the policy. I think that's something that is evaluated within the arbitral context, and you look at the policy and you see whether or not it's reasonable. And I think that's where questions around, whether or not you're able to section off particular types of employees and have differing obligations. I think that's where it'll taking that approach will become important.
I get you on that because not to be too hierarchical about this, but managers generally manage large groups of people, so they're generally more kind of tuned in. And if you're not in that position, maybe you need to be a little bit less connected. So I get it depends on the nature of the work and that type of stuff. Well, gentlemen, like I said, we're into overtime here, and our viewers are probably anxious for us to wrap up. But maybe Neil, any final thoughts? So if someone's watching this, they're feeling a little bit more informed, they have some particular questions, need to adapt it for their business or organization, for their work environment, what would you recommend to them, Neil?
Certainly have a quick review of the ministry's guidelines on these, see if you've got all the bases covered. And that's the best resource. I mean, it's the Minister of Labor that has released that information. So their information is up to date as to now. And of course, if things are complicated or a bit dicey in your workplace or doesn't fit squarely within one of these explanations or examples that the ministry provides, then we're certainly available to assist as well. It's an interesting piece of legislation, and it is not as straightforward as the title would suggest that it is.
Yeah, and Patrick, I'll come to you next. Is it fair, just to give people a little bit more context here? This is kind of we said this is new. We said, but this is new across many jurisdictions, right? Like no one really has figured that out. Is that a fair statement, Patrick?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fair. I
Okay.
think that where you will find a difference is that if you look at jurisdictions on an international basis, that's where you'll find that maybe there's some places in the world in which, they had a little more forethought when it came to this type of issue, and maybe took action, a long time ago, or definitely earlier than we have here. But the concept and the idea is certainly just now beginning to become more mainstream, and I think that it's certainly been advanced greatly by the new world that we live in terms of separating work and life external from work in terms of the pandemic. I think that's accelerated, like we've seen with regards to a lot of different things in the workplace. This is one of those things that's been accelerated by the new circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's one of those examples where we've seen an acceleration of pre-existing issues. So I'm sure, again, there's people that still have more questions. We're going to bring up your contact us information. Here it comes on screen right now. So there you go for Neil. His phone number and email. Same with Patrick. Phone number and email as well. I'm sure you can email them after hours. No, I'm joking. These gentlemen are never disconnected. Anyway, listen, Neil and Patrick, thank you so much. I always think that you guys bring great advice for people. You keep it real. So thank you for joining us again today. And I'm sure some people will contact you with some more questions. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks,
Okay.
Michael.
Have a great day. And do disconnect this summer. I encourage everyone to go off on vacation, turn off those phones. Just make sure you got a policy clarification on that before you do. All right, gentlemen, bye-bye. All right, before we sign off, just a reminder that you can continue to visit obj.ca. Talking about people that don't disconnect, it's the OBJ News team. So they're on it. They're providing original news content on that website, obj.ca. Visit it anytime, 24/7, 365. I also highly recommend, though, that you subscribe to OBJ Today, which is our weekday email newsletter. You get all the headlines and one nice package, as we say, never miss a headline. And of course, you can follow us on social media. We have a great surge in people following us on LinkedIn. In fact, we just broke the 25,000 follower mark. And since many of you are watching on YouTube, do us a favor. Hit the red subscribe button and then the little bell icon. And if you do that when we're live, you get a notification on your phone or tablet, so on and so forth. So thank you for joining in. Great show. Thanks. A big thanks to Eamon Harnden, providing lots of expert advice to business owners and managers, a firm that certainly that we highly recommend. With that, I'll bid you adieu and hope to see you real soon. Bye-bye.